Well, welcome, Savannah Brooks. Thank you so much for being with us. You're at KT Literary, right?
I am, yes.
Okay, and how long have you been there?
I've been there for about a year and a half now.
Nice. Do you like it?
I do. I love it. I was with the Jennifer D. Chiara Literary Agency for, about 7 years altogether. I started there as an intern and then moved to associate agent, and then moved over to KT Lit. And it's got such a great community feel. We have some, phenomenal, really inspiring authors, and I work with really phenomenal, inspiring people. So
Excellent. Yeah, I want to get in a little bit on the agenting stuff in a minute, but first I wanted to talk about your presentation at the Writers' Conference because I was so impressed by how interesting it was. And so here's a little snippet I pulled out of it. You said when you're creating a picture book or writing, you should interrogate your own memories and compare them to other evidence. And I thought that was so interesting. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean about comparing it to other evidence? And this is in the 7 kinds of archives of memory and imagination to pull from to create work.
yeah, definitely. I think sometimes we look at our memories and are like, I'm not 100% sure that's correct. So I'm just going to completely discount this. At least I know for myself, especially as a writer, I do that because I'm like, I don't want to put something out there that's not true or not real. Um, and so much of the intrigue of, I feel like, the human condition is that space where you're not really sure what's going on, where you're not sure if you remember something correctly, where you're not sure if you're seeing something correctly, where you're not sure if you're interpreting something correctly. Like staying in that really hazy space is a fascinating place to be. And I think, especially when you're writing for kids, looking at your own childhood and the things you experienced and like the memories that you do or don't have, really looking at them and paying attention to them, one just kind of brings back that child mindset. And I think you're more likely to write a picture book geared toward engaging kids than you are geared toward maybe just talking to kids. Um, but also it really gives you a chance to like examine childhood and to look at childhood now. Um, and to think of like, these funny things that happen in childhood, right? And these funny moments, especially moments of misremembrance, I think can make for like great, I don't know, great story mining, even if it's sort of absurd.
And they say that siblings often have very different viewpoints of how something happened in a family. So I know I find that with my 3 older brothers, they see it completely different.
Yep.
Do
Yep,
you have
absolutely.
siblings too?
Yeah, I have an older brother as well. I feel like the older brother, younger sister perspectives do not always align.
Definitely, definitely. And then you were also talking about the thing about jellyfish, and I thought that was so interesting because you had all these factoids that the author brought. Well, first of all, the author had sent it out to a magazine, and the editor kept it for a year and then rejected it after a year. Like that must have been heartbreaking. But it turned out okay because the author turned it into another book and took all those facts and instead of making it nonfiction, brought it into fiction and used all the facts in such an interesting way. In fact, one of the things in there was I was mentioning earlier to you when we were talking about blue. So you said Australian slang to make blue
Mhm.
is to make a mistake. So now I have to change my name because I realize why I make so many mistakes is because my last name's Blue.
I mean, or do you rebrand the idea of making a mistake into like, you know, s- story seeds?
I love that. Okay. You had so many interesting little facts about jellyfish and not just jellyfish, but other animals. And do you remember that book you gave a little briefing on?
Yep, yep. The thing about jellyfish by Allie Benjamin.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So the other thing you said was that you think that characters are obsessed. And I was wondering, like you said, find out what your character is obsessed about. And uh, how we mine our characters for the different aspects of themselves, but one of the aspects is what they're obsessed about. And I've never heard that before. Do you think that's just for teens or is it for adults too? Because I know Twilight is just about obsession, right?
Yeah.
Phyllis obsessed with Edward. And I remember that as a teenager. So is that something that's relevant in adult literature or is it just for children?
I think it's relevant across the board. Um, Humans are very obsessive creatures, just sort of naturally. And we might not necessarily think of ourselves that way, but so I used to be a professor at the University of Minnesota, and one of the icebreakers I would do with my students was to have them name 3 obsessions of theirs. And at first, everyone's really embarrassed by it, right? They're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to admit that I'm interested in something, that I'm obsessed with something, that I think about something all the time. But it ends up being the best icebreaker because that's like how you most truly get to know someone, right? Is the weird obsessions they have. And like the more specific, the better. Like I really think that you can oftentimes triangulate a character just based on 3 different obsessions of theirs. I mean, I say that about myself all the time. Like, really, the only things that you need to know about me are that I love books, nature, and fashion. Like, that's just my personality right there. Um, and so, sometimes I think characterization can be really, really tough because oftentimes we're writing a character to fall into a plot, and their characterization can feel like extremely dependent on the plot itself. It can be really hard to kind of pull your character outside of the story. But you do want to be able to do that. And what characters are obsessed with is a great way to do that, typically because you can use it as a motif through the story, the way that Allie Benjamin does with the thing about jellyfish. I mean, jellyfish are symbolic in a ton of different ways throughout the story. So you can always turn an obsession into a symbol, which is really nice. And it lends itself to being either a motif through the whole story, or just an extended metaphor, maybe for a chapter or however long you want. It lends itself to that because your character is thinking about these things all the time, right? So if they go back to them in metaphors, that makes sense. That's how we actually speak, right? We tend to compare things to the same things over and over again. um, and you end up teaching readers so much when you talk about obsession, because if you've ever hung out with like a middle school kid, you definitely know this, that they will just give you like 19 facts about something in a row. And it's the most exciting thing that they've ever done. We love that. Like, humans love to hoard knowledge. We love trivia facts like that. And so the more you can layer in the story, the more engaged your reader is.
I love that hoard knowledge. I'm taking notes. You're so interesting. Um, so I was just, first of all, I'm going to steal that. I'm going to have my students, I teach aviation. I'm going to have them write their 3 obsessions, and hopefully flying will be one of them.
Yeah, hopefully.
And you mentioned fashion as one of your obsessions. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. You have
Yeah.
a great Instagram channel. Do you want to tell us what that is?
Sure, sure. Yeah. So this is a feels a little bit ridiculous to me, honestly, as like a 32-year-old woman. But as Syd already knows, as some people might already know, I've had long COVID for a year and a half, for over a year and a half. And I'm really, really sick. Like, it's a very debilitating version of it. I mean, like, I'm literally sitting on the floor right now because I can't sit any higher than that, because my blood pressure is too low at the moment. And so when, you are sick like that, you typically do need to find some sort of kind of static hobby. Um, and I am just someone who, for my whole life, has had like way too many trendy clothes that are not functional at all. And so I started doing little photo shoots, right? Just putting together outfits, putting together photo shoots. And it's snowballed into like a pretty big hobby. And it's something I spend a lot of time doing, is just, curating these little fashion moments and going out like someplace like into the nature, in the city, and finding a fun place to shoot. It's kind of embarrassing when people walk by and you're just like posing in front of a tripod. But it's
That's
very fun.
awesome.
Yeah.
They're awesome. They're so beautiful. What would you like us to know about long COVID?
Oh gosh, that's a good question.
Well, it's
Um,
so it's amazing that you're here doing this when
yeah.
you're having a low blood pressure moment. So thank you. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I feel like this is very true of like anyone who has a chronic illness, is sort of like the mindset, like you can't take a sick day every day, which is very, very true. You just sort of have to learn how to navigate all of the crazy things that you go through. Um, I think probably one of the best things just to communicate about long COVID is how like incredibly debilitating it can be. Um, like I just moved back in with my parents because I can't live by myself. Like it's too dangerous. I fainted in the shower before. I've been like so weak that I couldn't move. So like if someone couldn't bring me food and water, like I very possibly just could have been stuck there. Like those things happen to me and they're just part of my life now and I have to be worried about them all the time. And that is so true of so many people living with chronic illness and so many people who are disabled, is kind of like the invisible support systems that we always rely on. The amount of people who are going to end up having long COVID, which right now, well, last time I checked, was estimated at about 7% of the adult population. And that's a pretty low ball, people think, just because a lot of people don't realize they have long COVID. I think just a lot of people are going to end up being in these really difficult health situations where they don't have the kind of support that they need. And that's something that I want people to be more aware of, is just that your friends and family and loved ones and neighbors, or even, the strangers on the street who hopefully you care about just because they're human, that, this is like a really big thing that a lot of people will be going through. And pretty much no matter what, it's debilitating in some way. I have like 8 different disabilities from it. And I have really intense disabilities from it. So like I have gastroparesis, which is just literally where you get so sick that your stomach quits working. So I can't digest anything normally. And, so sometimes I'm starving. I'm like literally starving to death sometimes. It can make you that sick. And
Wow.
on the flip side, it can be pretty light for some people too. So that's tough when you have a disease that affects people in so many different ways and affects people to such different extents, and that we just don't know very much about.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for that information. I'm sorry you're going through that. Well, I hope they get closer to a cure if that's possible, but
Yeah. Yeah, who knows?
yeah,
I think
who
that'll be
knows? What's
interesting.
been happening in the
Like,
last years.
yeah, it'll be really interesting in like 10 years to read, the studies. And once we actually have enough evidence, the like really, really nerdy part of my brain is like, that's kind of cool that you're like essentially a research subject, like a data point. If I'm gonna have like a mystery illness, I'd rather it be helpful to society.
Oh man, it's even more amazing than that you have sold so many books. You just like, wow, you've hit it out of the park. How many is it now?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I should know this off the top of my head, shouldn't I?
It's a lot.
Probably including IP projects, which are projects where, for people who aren't watching, where editors come up with the idea and then hire a writer to write it. So those aren't projects I'm pitching, they're projects that editors are typically coming to me for. Probably around 20.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, yes. So that's wonderful. But sometimes I've researched agents and I've seen that they've had like one sale since they've started. And so what's the secret to your success? I know you had some marketing background, and that's really important because an agent is part salesman, not just editor, but there has to be that element where they can imagine um, getting a sale and finding the right home for a project. So what do you think is your secret?
Yeah, like you mentioned, my educational background definitely helps. So my bachelor's degree is in marketing and my master's degree is in creative writing. And so those two things together are sort of like, it like makes an agent, right? Those things together. I am very, very strategy minded, which I think helps a lot. I go into relationships with my clients talking strategy. We talk about the different genres they want to write, the different ages they want to write for. We plot out like when we're going to enter those spaces. Usually we're parallel plotting. If you sell a picture book first, where are we going to go? If we sell, an adult thriller, where are we going to go? I work with a lot of people who I like lovingly refer to as chaos creators. I too am a chaos creator, like someone who's like, I wrote a picture book, I wrote a YA rom-com, I wrote like an adult sci-fi, I wrote a middle grade. I love writers like that, right? I love writers like that because I feel like I have the business brain to be able to make that kind of career really successful. I'll say it's usually slower, right? It usually starts slower, but I'm okay with that in a lot of ways too. I don't think anyone really gets into publishing to make money, or if they are, they're in the wrong industry for it. But I had a decade-long marketing career side by side when I started out agenting. So it actually took me a year and a half to make my first sale. But because I was working in like a very stable, because I was working my ass off in a very stable full-time job, and then this unstable full-time job, I felt like I was able to take on more of those people who I was like, yeah, we're going to have a slow start, maybe neither of us are going to make any money the first couple of years. But I really, really believe in this story, and I really believe in your story, and I really believe in your voice. And, there is a certain kind of financial sacrifice that takes, which is really a bummer. And I was in a lucky enough position where I felt like I could make it.
Awesome. That brings me to a couple of questions. First of all, if it's a numbers game, why don't agents just sign a bunch of writers and see what sticks, like throwing spaghetti at the wall?
Yes.
I've always wondered that. Like, why don't they just sign everyone and see?
I would say the truth of it, not to like frighten away any authors, but the truth of it is, for my authors, we're probably only going to sell maybe 75% of what we work on together. That's just not the reality of publishing, is that you sell every single thing that you write, or that you sell every single thing that you write when you write it. And that's also not always a bad thing, right? Sometimes you look at those stories a couple years later and you're like, oh man, yeah, I'm glad that we shelved that one.
I was gonna say 75 is not bad. That's great. I mean, it's much worse in screenwriting.
Oh yeah, especially I would say for picture book writers, because you do produce so much content. That number might be quite a bit lower. So a lot of it depends on like who you actually want to work with. I'm in contact with my authors like every month at least. So if I don't really like them as people, that's kind of a bummer. So I quite truly do base who I work with off of that. I really like all of my authors as people, which really, really helps. And it is, it's very, very much so just how much time do you have for everything. So when you get to the point of being a mid-career agent like I am, I think I have about 32 people who I represent right now. Should also know that off the top of my head, but I just signed a good amount of people. And so there's like math involved in when you sign another person, right? Like I just signed a picture book writer, a rom-com writer. So how much space do I have coming up in the next couple of months where I could be editing? Like we're always doing that kind of math. And so it's pretty common for agents to really spread out signing people just because of that, because I want to get, the manuscript who I signed Jane on, right? I want Jane and I to be able to work on that together. And I want to be able to get that out before I start working on, a manuscript with my next client. And so I think that also kind of depends on just like an agent's own work style and how they work best. I do not have the brain to work really chaotically, despite my creative chaos. Like my organized brain needs structure for any sort of professional setting. And so I also can't be working on multiple manuscripts at once. Like I just don't have the ability to do that. I do think there are some agents, who do. They have like 70 clients and they're just so good at stuff like that. Like they can jump from manuscript to manuscript. Maybe I'll be like that in like 15 years.
Well, tell me a story about a writer you found and then signed and went through the process and then to the published book, the whole journey.
Yeah. Let me just bring out my props here.
Yes, please do.
I feel like I'm constantly going back to this book which I love and is great. But it's called Sarah Rising. It's by my author, Ty Chapman. And so I live in Minneapolis and Ty lives in Minneapolis. And this book is published by Beaming Books, which is also located in Minneapolis. And as you can probably tell from the front, it's a very political picture book. And so it's actually written, it takes place in Minneapolis, which you can tell from like the skyline and the art, but it isn't actually ever written in the book. And it's really based on the Minneapolis uprising, which is where we had a few months of rioting after the murder of George Floyd. And so it's based on a little girl who goes to a police brutality protest with her dad for the first time. And, you know, it's just such a powerful story to be part of because like I was there. Like I lived on Lake Street, which is like where the 3rd Street precinct burned down. I was in those protests, like I was in the midst of it, you know, and so was Ty, and so was his editor. And that happens in New York all the time, I think, where you have, you know, the writer and the agent and the editor all live in the same place. But it doesn't happen outside of New York that often. And it especially doesn't happen outside of New York, like surrounding a historical event. And so this book is just like incredibly meaningful to me for that. And, you know, when it published, having like a book launch in Minneapolis, right? And having all of these people who are also there and who are also part of this historic event, it was just so cool. It just brings you back to like really the heart and the core of being an artist, which is connecting over community and like making change in the world in a way that you can like immediately see in the people around you.
Gosh, that's awesome. And then how long did it take to get that published?
Oh gosh. Well, this probably isn't a great example because we like kind of sold the idea just on the project. My cat's is going to come join us. This is Toast.
Oh,
Um, because he and the editor who bought it originally like connected on the idea itself, and they were like, oh yeah, we need to write that. And so when he wrote the draft and we sent it over to her, we sent it out more widely. It wasn't exclusive to her, but we had a pretty good idea that it was going to send. So that one sold pretty quickly. I will say for the past year, especially the past year and a half, selling books has been taking a long time. All 3 of the YA books that I sold last year have been on submission for over a year. I have picture books that sold that have been on submission for like over 8 months. I mean, it just, editors were super backlogged from COVID and from the Harper strike. Hearing back from people was rough.
so you're saying that for a year or 8 months, the editor has the manuscript and hasn't given you an answer?
Yeah, like it's just, you know, like in their inbox, and it's probably like the 300th manuscript in line.
Wow.
Um, you know, an editor is very similar to agents. The day job in an editor is incredibly logistical. It's a lot of emailing, it's a lot of contracts, it's a lot of like looking at the layouts of books. So they're usually not reading those submissions until they're off time. You know, a lot of editors live in Brooklyn. They have an hour and a half commute into Manhattan, and they have an hour and a half commute home. And so they spend 3 hours on the train reading, and 8 hours in the office emailing.
Do you think that you can recognize a book that will sell? Is it really subjective? Does it just depend on luck? Like if you send it to the right editor and they just happen to be looking for that? Or can you philosophize a little bit about, is there luck involved? Is it subjective? What's going on here?
Yes, all of the above. You know, there definitely are certain things that indicate that a book is going to be successful or not successful, right? I mean, just the level of writing ability, that's going to play a huge role. Voice, if you have a really voicey character, if you have a really hooky idea. And so what that means in publishing is like a plot that you can sum up in like a sentence or two that is just people want, right? People want it. I think like Razorblade Tears is a great example of this. One line, 2 ex-con fathers, their gay sons were murdered and now they're out for vengeance, right? That's hooky. People want that just based on that sentence. And if there's really good lyricism, especially in picture books where every single word counts and where you're meant to be reading out loud, the lyricism of a book is really going to shine. And so writing ability and voice are the two top things that I look for. And I'll admit, as someone who like went through an MFA program, I'm pretty picky about writing level. Like I'm really, really looking for that high caliber. But that does not necessarily mean that the book is going to sell. The luck part is a huge part of it. You know, a big part of my job is just staying in touch with editors and asking what they're looking for and having meetings with them. But it's not just an editor, you know, it's also their whole acquisition team. And there are plenty of times when I get a response from an editor that's like, I really love this, but I couldn't get my team on board. Or, but the last book that we picked up like this didn't do well. But we have another book coming out, you know, in 2 seasons that's really, really similar. So there's all sorts of stuff like that too, or even if the editor really wants to acquire it, they can't. And I'm usually looking for less than commercial things. I have like really oddball taste. I mean, I'm always selling super weird stuff that I love, that I adore, but that's not super commercial, right? And so I have editors who I just go back to over and over and over again because they also have that weird taste, right? So eventually you do learn that. I mean, I feel like constantly bothering the same 20 editors. But I'm selling stuff to them because we're figuring that out, right? Okay, I know that this is what they're really looking for, and I know that I have that coming up. And then once you know you start in a new genre, you kind of start all from the beginning in meeting editors. Like when I started representing nonfiction, I sent out an email and I was like, hey, I've been an agent for like 8 years, but I'm just representing nonfiction, so I'm essentially starting all over. And it's true, right? Like you don't know those people, you don't know their tastes, and so you just have to start taking notes.
I was going to ask, can you send to an editor you don't know?
Yes, you can and do. A lot of where I get information from editors, if I haven't been able to meet with them or if they haven't sent out any sort of wish list, is editors use manuscriptwishlist.com also, which is pretty helpful. But more so, I'm looking at Publishers Marketplace and, you know, the actual books that they've acquired, because that shows you not only like what they're really willing to fight for, but also what their editorial team is willing to pick up.
What does it mean when a agent rejects a book and says, I didn't connect with the characters? Do they just not like the personality? Do they not like the voice, do you think? Or they just aren't into it?
Yeah, you know, I think it can probably mean a handful of things, but my guess would be that it comes down to two. Either that they're not connecting with the voice, um, which might be subjective, but is more likely code that the voice isn't commercial enough, or it's that they don't feel like the voice of the character is doing very much for the plot or is pulling the plot forward. Especially when you're in kid lit, so middle grade and young adult. So much of middle grade and young adult is telling a similar story, right? Especially contemporary, because the kids need to be in a school setting. There needs to be some sort of guardian, or the lack of the guardian is the big thing. They're like rote day-to-day things that they have to be doing. And so the voice of your main character is oftentimes just what drives the entire narrative. So sometimes it might just be like, I don't think this voice is strong enough to drive this particular narrative. Or, and I will say, I see this the most in middle grade, that the voice just isn't right. I would say if you're kind of like shoehorning yourself into writing middle grade, it's probably not the best place for you, because the voice is exceptionally tricky. It has to be funny, it has to be authentic, it can't be patronizing, it has to be on the right reading level. Like it's tough out there.
Do you think there's trends in voices, like the snarky voice?
Yeah. You know, I think some voices like the snarky voice are just evergreen. I think that's people are always going to want it. It's very true to middle grade. But I do think that when certain authors do really well in certain spaces, they become kind of trendy in areas. So like, I mean, a really good example of this was like when Mercedes Suarez changes gears, I'm pretty sure is the name. So Meg Medina, when her middle grade came out, it was really a slice of life book. And that hadn't been very popular, right? For a long time, we've been seeing like all commercial all the way, like 100% action. And then we got this kind of quieter slice of life book, and you started to see more of them pop up, right, in middle grade. It didn't like change the whole wave of the trend, but as agents now, I can and I have right comp to that book, and editors are like, oh yeah, that did really well. Of course, Meg Medina is like a superstar and super famous, so I would buy anything she writes, right? Which is probably true of all editors. But it is helpful when you have authors kind of like reintroducing interesting things, or having a new perspective, right? Or like changing up the pacing of middle grade and it works. You see that ripple out.
Awesome. And so I had a question about picture books really quick. Do you think that a picture book writer should definitely team up with an artist? Well, my mom's an artist, and I was talking to her about it, and she's like, "Well, of course you need to send it with pictures. That's what makes the book." And I'm like, "No, it's the words that make the book."
Yes. Your instinct is correct. Yeah. So picture book writers should not pair up with author or with illustrators. Um, and of course, there are always exceptions to this, but I will give a couple of reasons why. The biggest one is that the art director ultimately makes a decision on who the illustrator is. So even if you like commission an illustrator to illustrate your book, you might end out like sending to an agent, or your agent might end out sending to an editor who's like, I absolutely love this text. And they're not going to buy the illustration, and they're going to hire an illustrator. So you will have essentially just like paid for nothing. But ultimately it's the art director who like brings on the illustrator. And I think sometimes authors can get kind of precious about the picture books and be like, I don't want anyone else bringing pictures in. Like, I want to decide who my own illustrator is. And to that, I just like to give like the really, really blunt answer of like, picture book authors get paid like 50,000. Picture book illustrators can get paid like $50,000. You are not hiring the best illustrator, right? You're not hiring the best illustrator that an art director can. I would trust them to do their job, because they've been hired for that. And truly part of the magic of picture books is that collaboration, is seeing an artist bring something to life. So I would say, yeah, unless you have a friend or a family member or like partner or someone else who is a really, really good illustrator who you really want to be illustrating together, you probably don't need to look for one. And I would also say be really honest with yourself about how good the illustrator is. If it doesn't seem like they could be doing kind of like animated stuff, especially if you're doing more Pixar-y, or if it doesn't seem like, gosh, I don't know, I guess just go to a bookstore and look at it.
Yeah.
Illustration is incredibly competitive. It is so competitive, and the bar is super, super high.
Awesome. Well, that was really good information. I didn't know that about the caliber. That makes sense of the artist that you're hiring. 50,000 is like, wow, yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We are just about out of time, so I wanted to ask you if there was anything you wanted to add that about what you're looking for, or any events you have coming up, or
Oh gosh, well, yeah, I'm doing a conference tomorrow and teaching a class on Saturday, which is maybe kind of quick events coming up. Um, what I'm looking for, that's a great question. I'm close to queries right now. Our whole agency closes down for the month of December, which is pretty popular. Publishing is so slow in December. It's great. So I'll open back up in January. And gosh, I really am looking to build up the adult side of my list pretty specifically. I'm always bringing on new kid lit writers because I just love it. But that's where I have the most space on my list, is on the adult side. And I've really, really been loving like meaty and thoughtful, but super fun things. I've been loving the kind of upmarket space, which I like to call literary themes and commercial packaging. That's really what upmarket is. And I've been really, really loving that space where you have like a fun, quick, really engaging structure for a story, but what's happening inside the story is complicated and character driven. That's been really, really great. I mean, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabriella Zevin, I think, was my favorite book this year. So like books like that, I would love to acquire. Oh, man, I should have a better answer for this off the top of my
That's a great answer. And it's always changing too. So,
Yes.
well, I could always talk to you forever. So maybe we'll have to do this again and you can update your list because you
Yeah.
have these little gems in what you're talking about I've never heard before. And I've heard a lot from agents and editors. So you're very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. No, well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was great meeting you. It's great seeing you again. Yeah, I love doing things like this. So anytime you want to invite me,
Thank
I'm
you
here.
so much.
I'm here virtually.
Awesome. Thank you.